welcome everybody to this year's first webinar sponsored by the Division 15 of the American Psychological Association. Today, we will be exploring the topic of race and equity. The two co-hosts for this are myself, Jason Chen, and David Morris. For this webinar, we have invited Dr. DeLeon Gray and some of the students who work with him on projects that deal specifically with race and equity. David and I believe that educational psychologists are all too often comfortable thinking of race as just a variable to plug into our statistical models. But race is so much more than that, especially when the research is aimed at how educators can promote more equitable learning spaces. The research that Dr. Gray and his team have engaged in reflects that complexity and pushes the literature forward in exciting ways. So before we get started and I turn this over to Dr. Gray, let me just point out a couple of things about the Zoom webinar. First, this webinar is being recorded. And so after we are done, it will be posted to Division 15's website so that everyone can view it. Second, this webinar allows everyone to type comments into Zoom's chat box. So please do use this feature at any point to ask questions or pose a thought. The chat box will be the primary way that you can ask questions to the panelists because David and I will be monitoring this chat box for questions, which we will relay to Dr. Gray and his team after their presentation. Dr. Gray and his team will talk about another platform called GroupMe, which they will use to continue the conversation after the webinar ends. And finally, just as a fun thing to do and to give everyone a sense for where we all are, I'd like everyone to just share quickly where they are joining from. I'm joining this webinar from Williamsburg, Virginia. David?
I'm in La Plata, Maryland.
Prince George's County, Maryland.
I'm in Marion, Indiana.
I'm in Lansing, Michigan.
Hi, I'm also in Lansing, Michigan.
Hi, I'm in Los Angeles, California.
All right, great. And Wade George, who is helping us with technology, he is joining us from?
Chicago, Illinois.
Fantastic. And folks who are attending the webinar, we'd love to hear from you. Just go ahead and enter into the chat box where you are joining us from. Now, as everybody is entering in, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Gray and his team.
Greetings, everyone. There are a number of things that I'm excited about sharing with you today, and it's definitely going to be quite a group thing. So first of all, I'd like to give shout outs. I can't start without giving a couple shout outs. I have to give a shout out to a few of my mentors, Eric and Lindley Anderman. Thank you for tuning in and listening and just continuing to support my growth as a scholar and the way I grow into my own perspectives as a scholar. But thank you for providing me with that foundational training that I have needed and a platform that I needed to keep going. So also want to shout out the graduate students who are a part of this webinar with me. So we're going by the Research Practice Collective because they are currently enrolled in a course with me at Michigan State. And so we've had a very, very great vibe in there around this idea of community engaged scholarship. And so we want to continue that beyond the class. And so that includes different events, different programming opportunities, and different ways of supporting one another, like this webinar, like our mixtape that we're currently working on, and like a GroupMe that we'll tell you about later on today. And so also want to say thank you to all of the graduate students who are joining the call virtually from different areas across the country. I appreciate you because you keep me in tune with what's happening on the ground level, and you allow me to unlearn a number of things that might have simply been just accepted as a way of life as an educational psychologist for me. And so when I travel to different universities, I'm noticing a trend. And it's the type of graduate student who's coming into graduate school now. They're different from the type of graduate student that might have entered educational psychology programs 10 or say 15 years ago. They really, really care about making the difference. So it's the larger social political climate of our country or other things that, is really making this why the most important just rigor, processes, and understanding like just fundamental aspects of psychological principles and how they manifest in school environments, that's not enough for them, right? They really want to have a true impact. And so we need to be in a position as educational psychology programs to be able to support them and provide them with that sense of fit in terms of what they're looking for. So what I'm really calling for in this presentation is a way forward, not only in thinking about how to support these students, but in a way of approaching our work that accommodates the community partners that we partner with. So today we'll raise a number of questions, but these questions are all about studying populations that you want to serve in a humanizing way. We will be talking about the things that don't always make it into empirical journal articles, but serve as the secret sauce behind some of our studies. And so there are a few questions that I want to pose to you at the very beginning of this conversation, but they all involve this idea of a commitment to trust, humility, and responsiveness. So have we established enough trust as educational psychologists for our community partners to tell us the truth? Are we honest about what we as educational psychologists don't know about culture and what we stand to learn from our community partners? And third, do we demonstrate that we have heard our community partners, and are we functioning in a way that's really agile enough to honor their perspectives in our work? So I'll turn it over to Brooke.
So we want to start off by creating a shared definition of what we mean when we say community engaged scholarship. So what we're referring to is, as you see in this definition, is a partnership between universities and communities that's mutually beneficial and intentionally designed to work collaboratively to address public issues. So this approach to scholarship is not a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather community engaged scholarship is really designed with flexibility in mind to really fit the needs of that particular community and what their priorities are. So as you hear a variety of examples throughout this webinar, I'd like for you to notice examples of where, at which stage or stages do you see community partners involved in the research process. So for example, research partners may help actually co-create or be the source of the research idea, helping to establish what questions will be answered according to their priorities in that community. Or there may be a shared priority between the community and the researcher that gets framed in a collaborative way. Another example of how this can take place is having community partners involved in the actual data collection process. So there could be a time when we, as researchers, may ask ourselves, what is the added value of having, for example, maybe students interview other students or teachers interview other teachers, and so that we get to kind of build off that shared experience and that relationship that's already there, and that can help us overcome potential barriers to full answers that we could get from our participants. So the various stages of the research process could be a good framework for us to use as we begin to kind of negotiate how do community partners be involved throughout this partnership. So now Dr. Gray is going to talk a little bit more about why this work is really important.
So there are a number of reasons why this work is important, but I also want to underscore that it's important to understand your why. And it's important for two reasons. One is that it serves as a compass for you in making decisions, but it also serves as a source of confidence when making difficult decisions. The reason why I say that is because the things that your community partners need might be in direct conflict with the type of decisions you made if you focus squarely on promotion and tenure as a faculty member. And so we need to find a way to make decisions where we're not focusing on what is the better decision to make, but what is the right decision to make. And so, by having a why, it helps us get in touch with the right decision when we get into difficult situations where somebody might be disappointed, mad, or just unappreciative of the way we went about things. We have a compass that shows us that we are headed towards the right path. So as one example of this, I'll share a little bit about my why. So this is a lapel pin that I'm currently designing for my home church that I grew up in Southeast Washington, D.C. is based on a mural that sits behind the pulpit of the church. And as an adolescent, I'd like to say that I was always paying attention, but sometimes my mind would wander. But with this sitting behind the pulpit, my mind would wander and I would think about the Black leaders who embrace a communal imperative in their work that they did in their lives. And it made me think about what is the standard that I need to be striving towards. And so these individuals mobilized people, they brought people together, and they had a cause that was bigger than themselves. And so they really cared about the social impact of what they were doing. And so this, for me, serves as the standard.
Hi, everyone, and my name is Brooke Harris Thomas, and I am over at Michigan State. And so the reason why I really care about Community Engaged Scholarship is because I believe that giving a voice to students and teachers and seeing as valuable the contributions of those we're attempting to serve will lead us to more practical and helpful outcomes as researchers. Among many sources of inspiration when I think about doing this sort of work, Sister Act 2 came to mind because I think it's this really classic example of what magic and beauty can happen when the assets of students and their communities are really valued and given opportunities to lead in a collaborative way. I just think it's really important that students and teachers feel heard and a part of the process.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Lee, and I'm also at Michigan State University. And the reason why I was interested in doing equity-focused motivation research was because of my experiences teaching high school English in the rural Mississippi Delta. When I was teaching there, it was evident that we cannot separate history, our history of inequality, from the current experiences of our students. And so I'm very interested in taking a history-informed approach to community-engaged scholarship. And in particular, my research is inspired in part by the idea expressed in this quote from Richard Wright of how can we ensure that our students today don't have the impulse to dream slowly beaten out of them by their experiences in school and in the world.
Hi, I'm Krista Lehrer, and I'm also a PhD student at Michigan State. So when I think of why I do community engaged work and why it's so important, I think of the parable of the elephant and the math scientist. So as researchers, we often have these non-visible spots in our work and on our research. And so as you can see, there's one scientist thinking that the part of the elephant is a tree, while another is thinking that that part is a snake. And community engaged work in particular can broaden our perspectives and communication patterns if we really engage with the community that we're serving and the community that we're working in. By doing this, we're more likely to understand the bigger picture because after all, the communities know themselves best.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Briana Greene. I'm a first-year PhD student at Michigan State. The reason why I engage in community engaged scholarship is because I think it gives so much meaning and color to the research. I feel that sometimes we forget that our community partners are people who have dreams, who have things that they want to build, have beliefs, have challenges that they have faced. And when we really come together as equal listening partners and equal contributors, we can meld all of those experiences into how we approach research, but then also the practical insights that we're able to give our teachers and some of our other stakeholders. This picture, it was taken inside of a school that I did my student teaching and then later iScholar research. And it was really inspiring to me to know that my community partners have very similar ideals or wanted to represent Black people and my people in a way that was really inspiring. And so in addition to that, you don't get the opportunities to take pictures and capture things going on inside of schools unless you're inside of these places. And so next I want to introduce iScholar, which is the project where I came to learn about community engaged research. iScholar is a National Science Foundation project that brought together NC State university members and the Durham community. And so in this picture, you have Dr. Gray. I want to recognize Dr. Lauren Bryant. as well as fellow graduate student Tamika McElveen. And then I also had the opportunity to work with really great undergraduates such as Alexa DeFalco and Alex Alosu, who had insights to bring just as well as the rest of us. And so in this project, we were partnering to provide students with opportunities to see themselves as change agents in their communities now and potentially in the future. One thing that was really unique about this project and that idea of creating and establishing trust is that this project started off in 2 after-school settings and transformed into being in one of our schools in their electives setting. We were able to host field trips, bringing students to NC State. They were able to interact with minority college students as well as minority professionals. Just an array of events and activities that turn research into just something so personal and so advanced, if you will. We created curriculum together. We workshopped together. We ate meals together. We made our schedules flexible for one another. We made our research flexible for one another, again, to really fold in all of the community partners' insights. And so as we move this conversation forward, I think it's important to think about how are we showing up for our partners. And so I'll turn it over to Krystal at this point.
But before we jump into that piece, I just want to add one piece of important nugget to what you said. You mentioned like sharing meals with the partners. And that's very important because food can be cultural, food can be communal. And so there's nothing that will stop people in their tracks more than a nice meal. So when we think about our partners, what does it mean to even try to spoil our partners in a very meaningful way and think about everyday ways of having cultural experiences with them? So, you know, having important meals with our community partners is disarming in a number of ways. Giving like snacks to like students sometimes just shows that you just care about them and their existence in a number of ways. And so these smaller strategies have been used to disarm our community partners and really show that we're in it to really like just to connect with them on a very human level.
Wonderful, thank you for adding that. So as community engaged scholars, it's important to show up in our communities, as Briana mentioned. Showing up in our communities has a number of affordances for not only the communities, but for yourself as well. This is an opportunity to learn from the community in informal spaces outside of the research site, and can also allow the community to start to build trust in you, This can be demonstrated in a number of ways. And so to name only a few, this could look like showing up to a school or teacher event outside of the regular school hours, or participating in a fundraising event. So to provide a concrete example that I was really fortunate to be part of in the past couple of months, this year for Martin Luther King Day, teachers in Dearborn, Michigan took students to the Henry Ford Museum on Free Museum Day. As community engaged scholars, this is one way to show up for students and their families, especially on days that are historic and meaningful for racial and ethnic minority groups. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the few ways that you have showed up for your community. So feel free to drop those in the Zoom chat or in the group meet. But first, Dr. Gray is going to talk a little bit more about the ways that you can show up for your community.
Yeah, so let's start with this picture. So this picture is an image of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated and our collective partners, really, and families. So my fraternity is the same fraternity that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a part of. And so that's significant because we had a hand in creating this memorial in Washington, D.C., and really just being one of the driving forces behind putting this together and fundraising for it. Now, the reason why that connects to Krystal's point is because when we go into different environments, let's say I walked into a school on January 23rd of this year. My teacher partners, they might ask me a question like, so what did you do this weekend? I might tell them I went to the movies, hung out with family, hung out with friends. But, you know, if MLK Day had just passed, they might notice that something is missing. And it's not that they're intentionally trying to judge us. It's just that sometimes our commitment to equity and diversity might not always match our actions. So how can we make these two things harmonious and aligned with one another? It doesn't have to just be on big events or big holidays, as Krystal mentioned. It also can be on everyday things. So for our iScholar project, for example, we support teachers' ambitions and visions by doing things like showing up at their events if they are doing musicals or plays. Or we might show up to different school events like a Holocaust display. We also might come to other events like students' basketball games or football games and just hang out, or in some cases provide the opportunity during our teacher professional development sessions for teachers to express their entrepreneurial ventures and get a chance to market some of that to the other people in the room. And so these events are important because they create spaces or opportunities to genuinely be in community and understand more about the worlds of our teachers and where they're coming from. And this leads to a larger sense of collective commitment and belonging on a project that you just can't get by sitting across from the table and asking, what are you trying to get out of or bring to this partnership? Because here's what I'm bringing. In other words, we move from more of a transactional way of dealing with our community partners to a way that really acknowledges and respects their visions and, you know, life commitments in a way that builds trust at the end of the day.
Another aspect of this work that influences how we show up in our communities and how we approach our community partners is the methods that we choose to use. And our methods reflect deeper assumptions in how we're approaching our work. In their book on research design, Krystal and Krystal call upon researchers to think about how their choice of research design may reflect a particular worldview or general philosophical orientation about the world and the nature of research. They suggest that the use of quantitative methods tends to be most aligned with a post-positivist worldview, a philosophy that espouses that there are laws or theories that govern the world. Furthermore, there is an assumption that these laws and theories can be tested using quantitative measurement. Thus, this approach relies upon deductive reasoning. In contrast to quantitative methods, qualitative methods tend to be aligned with a constructivist worldview. And according to this philosophy, meaning is co-constructed in partnership with participants through direct social interaction. And then through this meaning-making process, the researchers are able to get a deeper personal, historical, and cultural contextual information to inform their research. Given that educational psychology has traditionally used quantitative methods and therefore relies upon a post-positivist philosophy, it can lead to blind spots in doing culturally informed research. So we wanted to ask this question of how can we as EdPsych researchers actively work to address cultural blind spots that come from doing work in a quant dominant field?
And so just to build on that, I'd like to build on your comments, Al, by thinking about how this point resonates with me as someone who has been trained primarily as a quantitative researcher in graduate school and who has to deal with the tension of being a primarily quantitative researcher on one hand, while being a scholar of color on the other, knowing that several of my contemporaries, they just don't get down with quant methods at all. They think these methods are colonizing. They think these methods are racist. But for me being trained in these methods, I'm going to find a way to make the best of these methods. And there are different approaches that people are using to do so. Some have privileged this idea of quant crit. You know, what I've been focusing on a lot in my work is the way to weave qualitative research methods and approaches throughout the work to better contextualize my research, to iterate, you know, on my research designs, and also to think about programming aspects of our research. So in other words, Even if you are very much so quant focused in your training, and if you're like me and you refuse to give up quant methods altogether because you think that there's something to these methods that you really are drawn to, then there's ways to like go beyond your training to stretch yourself in a number of ways. As an example, let's talk about one qualitative approach, just observations, right? So as a way to weave that in, that I kind of stumbled upon, I normally dress up for my job at NC State, so I like to wear dress clothes to work. However, I was going to one of our partner school sites, and I had to carry a large box with a lot of materials in it. It made sense to be comfortable in clothes that were, built for carrying stuff around. So I had on some relaxed clothes, maybe a hoodie, some jeans, and some sneakers. So I walk into the classroom, drop off the box, just say hey to the teacher. The teacher wants me to talk to the students. Well, before I talked, I noticed something was different. The students were really attending to me. And one of the black males in the room, he said, "I like your shoes, mister." And the teacher said, "You don't know anything about those shoes. What are those shoes?" And so he said, "These are foam posits." And the teacher said, "Wrong, these are flight posits. Get your facts straight." So that led to a whole discussion about these shoes that we had been collecting since back in the day. The teacher had collected his and held on to his for a while. I had sold a lot of shoes, like Jordans, that I would buy for, let's say, $200 and flip them for about $500. So the light bulb started going off in terms of the value of shoes and students thinking about this. But it really led my research team to think a lot deeper around the programming aspects of our project. We as motivation researchers sometimes study motivational processes, but these larger cultural elements that allow students to really engage deeply in lessons don't always show up in our measures, right? So without spending the time just in environments, just observing, we would not have been able to do things like weave sneaker culture into the design of our lessons to really connect with these students' cultural meaning system. As another example of things that we can do, we can be mindful of privileging conventions in our field over being responsive to the context that we're in. So in this case, I'm talking about this idea of objectivity that really is just connected to being in a quant dominant field and thinking about this objectivity in a number of ways. So I want to privilege two scholars who have shaped my thinking in this. I was working on a chapter for a book by Jessica DeQueer-Gumby and Paul Schutz, where they asked us to write about a topic related to belonging. And we mentioned the word objective in our work. And Paul, in editing, he made the comment, some of us don't believe in the myth of objectivity. I also want to, talk about Avi Kaplan's comment to me when I was a grad student that stuck out to me as well, when he said, if you as a researcher are in a classroom of students, you're already intervening, why not be a full participant? Now, fast forward to iScholar. Briana and I are in a classroom and we have cameras. I'm in the back, trying to set up shop with the camera while the teacher and students are working on activities so we can get some, observational data. However, Briana is an undergraduate at this time. This is her first time jumping into the school as a researcher. What does she do? She goes up with the camera to students and in a first person kind of way is engaging with them, asking them about what they're doing, how cool it is, and it's very much so in the mix, right? But students are responding to her different from me, right? I'm thinking that this project is really gonna blow up right now, but she's showing me a different way. By leaning into the project, everybody was more comfortable. I was the creep in the back who needed to get my act together and jump in the mix and really be a part of the conversation in a first person kind of way. And she was leading the way by showing me that there's a different way to do things. You don't always have to be distant from your data, lean into your data a bit more. Another thing that we can do is operate from a place of abundance and not scarcity. So the model for me used to be to get all the data I could get while the window was open to collect the data inside of the school, because I didn't know the next time I would be able to collect data inside of that school. Well, with our project, we found that teachers didn't want us to survey their students to death and take up valuable instructional time. So we needed to adjust. So now the model is to collect fewer items and to be respectful of participants in ways that keep the door open for a long-term partnership. And finally, I want to emphasize something that was done as well around not just allowing theory to dictate what our measures look like without involving our community partners in the development of our measures. And I really want to give a shout out to my colleague, Lauren Bryant, with this, because we really built this together, but she definitely took a lead role in this process. So what you're looking at right now is a visual of an observation measure that was co-created with the teachers in the iScholar project. So the teachers came to a working professional development where they were learning about communal learning opportunities by reading snippets of articles from Jerry Brophy, and him talking about meaning, as well as reading from different teacher education frameworks like Teaching for Freedom. So this idea for how to structure a PD in this way came from reading the works of people like Revati Kumar and her article on weaving cultural relevance and motivation research. So what you see here is four response categories that the observers are looking for. By the way, our observers were from the same school district. They're national board certified teachers, African-American women who had taught, similar STEM-related subjects. So we had them do our observations, but they said that 4 categories for responses to serving the community, humanity, and one another would be the most meaningful way of categorizing and scoring our observations, because this is what teachers were used to seeing during their observations during the school year. These examples that you see are examples that teachers came up with in the professional development, which made everybody more comfortable because the teachers knew the types of things that we might look for, although we made room for things that were outside of this list, of course, to be observed in the classroom. But these examples really made everybody comfortable. Everyone was on the same page, and we had a larger vision for what we were after, and it built trust.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about exactly what Dr. Gray is doing. He's storytelling, essentially. And so in his 1992 article, Dr. David Berliner, in his article Telling the Stories of Educational Psychology, makes this case for how important storytelling is and how it can powerfully drive home a point or a concept or an idea to an individual in a unique way. He goes on to quote Robert Cole's argument that only through narratives can another's life really be comprehended. And so I think that community engaged scholarship at its best is really able to communicate an accurate and helpful story of that community that's involved in the research for the purposes of their own benefit. So as you all either begin or continue to do this work, we want to invite you to really consider, how are you creating and sharing the stories of educational psychology in meaningful ways? As I mentioned very briefly earlier, there's lots of different ways in which community partners can be involved in the research process. And in addressing the storytelling point, I just wanted to bring up 2 points or examples. And the first is the act of member checking the conclusions that we draw from the data we've collected. Whether you're collecting qualitative data or quantitative data or some sort of mixed method study, member checking can be a really meaningful way to ensure a proper representation of the communities that are involved. So it's just taking the time to ask, does the story that we've painted here really ring true to you and from your experience? And then the second point I wanted to bring up was just asking yourself at the end of a study, have your community partners had a voice in whom and how the results are being shared? Are they involved in the process of sharing out themselves, whether it's at conferences or in their own community spaces? And then just wanting to encourage us to allow them to allowing community partners to be a part of deciding what happens next can really up the sense of mutuality for all that are involved. So now Briana's going to talk a little bit more about some specific examples of how to do that.
Yeah, so I wanted to share how storytelling may have taken shape in iScholar. And one way of thinking about storytelling in community engaged work is allowing for partners the visibility to tell their own stories. And so there was a lot of different ways that I think storytelling took place. One that I think was unique, Lexi, one of our undergrads, was a pre-service teacher at the time, and she thought that the teachers that were partnering had a lot of insights about what was going on in their actual classrooms, as well as what was going on with iScholar. And so she planned a PGU, which at NC State is a professional growth unit for pre-service teachers. She organized this and allowed for the iScholar teachers, again, to share about their different experiences, to interact with pre-service teachers, for pre-service teachers to have their questions answered. There were opportunities for community partners and us at NC State to lead presentations together, lead workshops together. Something that came to mind as Dr. Gray was speaking about the shoes, what turned into storytelling about shoes with the students turned into a lesson for iScholar. But then it also turned into a workshop session with Canadian 4th and 5th graders. So thinking about how stories can just keep going and moving and being able to impact more people than the original people that story was created by or shared to. There was also opportunity to share story, again, in how we think about capturing observations or what we're even capturing. Those stories of our partners impact those research methods and tools that we're creating. And then lastly, I also wanted to share how as educational psychology is moving forward and thinking about story, websites are, I think, a unique way of sharing about your projects, the community partners sharing about their contributions or what they're taking away from it or what they're learning in the process, but then also allowing for our stories, our research, to be accessible to so many people and letting that story to continue to inspire other research, other teaching practices, policy, and so on.
And so related to that point, I'm gonna plug our website. It's weareiScholar.org. And the reason why I'm plugging that is because if you notice on the home page, if you scroll through, you see that we highlight our teachers in our project and had a teacher spotlight. One of our teachers recently has been featured in Forbes. He has since gone on to begin a PhD at NC State University and has just finished his TED Talk, right? So they have their own ambitions, their own visions for where they're headed. And sometimes it's just important to be a part of the movement that is happening and being on the right side of history, rather than, just giving them another task to do. Why not be a tailwind and really support where they're trying to go? So, not only are narratives important to privilege on spaces like websites, but, it's important to just be a part of the narrative in the right way. So with that in mind, I wanted to do two things. The first is, if people are interested in learning about a variety of different ways that scholars in educational psychology are thinking about equity focused work in race and culture, then you can go to the special issue of Contemporary Educational Psychology on race reimaging. So that information is featured here. The guest editors were Jamal Matthews and Francesca Lopez. And thanks to their vision, and thanks for Jessica DeQueer-Gunby's vision of promoting race reimaging along with Paul Schutz, we now have a larger movement where we should see a spectrum of different ways that people embrace race and culture. And community-engaged scholarship is one of those ways that our team wishes to promote things. So what you can find here is, if you want to be a part of continued conversations and share resources or build community, or even just hear about other things that we're trying out and growing together, then you can join our GroupMe using this on the side, the square QR code thing. But we can also share the link with you if you need that link to join the GroupMe. But it's an app, it's like a text messaging kind of chat room feature, but you can share all kinds of things on there. So as things come to us after this talk and we're reflecting, we'll just post things as they come to us, videos, resources, and just really keep the conversation around community engaged educational psychology scholars alive. So thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Dr. Gray and team. Let's see. So we have about 20 minutes to engage in some Q&A, and you may be aware that the chat window has been lighting up, which is awesome. And so as we wind this webinar up, we'd like to bring up a couple of questions that came to mind through the chat windows. The first one that we were going to ask, or we're going to elevate. Here's the question. It says, how are we working with researchers outside of EdPsych to ensure cultural responsibility and address cultural blind spots?
Yeah, that question is so important. So I'm going to answer, and if any of the other presenters would like to chime in, great, please do so. So at NC State, my department is teacher education and learning sciences. And so we have an EdPsych program that's embedded within that umbrella. So that really first opened my eyes to say, look at all of these ways that teacher education is more advanced than us when it comes to conversations about equity and culture, right? Jessica DeQueer-Gumby's article on race reimaging with Paul Schutz also helps us think a little differently as well, because what she says in the article is she's talking about critical race theory and elevating critical race theory. But at the end of the day, it doesn't have to be critical race theory. You know, there are several different frameworks that all have an equity focus that you can use to weave with perspectives in EdPsych. And so coming to Michigan State as a scholar in residence, I've been really intentional this year about connecting with people in the #1 teacher education department in the world. And I say that with a level of enthusiasm because they're thinking very much so differently. But it's interesting how we can be siloed and separated and think about things like, you know, our methods being a driver for who we should talk to versus our frameworks and perspectives, looking for commonalities and how, you know, how are they talking about belonging versus how we're talking about belonging, and what are the mergers? You know, what ways can they lead us in terms of frameworks like teaching for freedom or other perspectives in teacher education that teach us ways of thinking about things like emancipatory pedagogies in our work. So I think the big strategy that we need to employ is to connect further with our teacher education colleagues, not only just reading their work in journals, but also just taking them out to lunch, having conversations, and talking to the grad students as well, just to know what's on the horizon in the field and how we can be a part of that conversation and look for mergers. But we should look to listen first, and then look to, like, you know, borrow from their frameworks. And the reason why is not because they just are more advanced in culture. It's also because, as Helen Patrick and Lily Anderman put it in their educational psychologist article in 2011, EdPsych has always been on the margins, well, not always, for a while, been on the margins in teacher education. We have, like, usually one class that we teach to teacher education students, and even that class is seen as something where we don't add a lot of value. And so, you know, our relevance depends on us being able to get along and privilege their frameworks and show the connections between the two, rather than operating separately.
Okay. Just as a note, many of you wanted some good sources for Quant Crit, and some of the panelists have provided links and references for you in the chat. We'll work to make sure that you have the text of that chat. After this is over, we'll have a link for you so that you'll have that as well.
And we'll
in the back, go ahead.
And we can also post a few more in the group me as well, in case others mind after the chat.
So along those lines, another one of the questions we received is, what suggestions do you have for readings or other resources for non-people of color who are trying to learn how to do this work in an anti-racist way?
Brooke?
I mean, I think the thing that comes to mind is that it wouldn't be different. The resources would be the same. It's just a matter of kind of building back off the point that Dr. Gray was talking about. I think so and it's not only community partners going out and finding those community partners, but I think this work has to be done within a research community as well, because we all have blind spots in areas that we need to have someone else help give some perspective to. So even the idea of me going at it alone as a researcher and trying to help a community isn't consistent with the whole, I think, ethos of what community engaged research and scholarship is. So even beyond paper resources, I think making sure that you can find yourself within a community of people like we have here, which is a really great thing, where we can toss out ideas and get perspective and be pointed in different directions that helps shed light on things that we may not know. So I think that's also a really important thing, to not silo yourself when you're trying to do this work.
Thanks, Brooke. That's a really great point. And I think that that's something that a lot of funding organizations are now also really pushing toward, like NSF, IES, a number of organizations. If you want to get funding from them, they really, really highly encourage you to partner with folks from a variety of fields. The National Science Foundation grant that I'm working on right now, I'm partnered with geologists. I never thought in a million years I'd partner with people who study rocks, because I didn't think that they had anything to do with kids.
Right.
And it's phenomenal how that interdisciplinarity really, really enriches the field. So that's something that I think that educational psychologists absolutely must do, not just to survive, but really to do the best science that we can. So thank you for putting that comment out there, Brooke.
And just to add a couple of resources that really have, and people who really inspired work for me. One person who's been on my mind a lot lately is Megan Bang. She is a learning scientist, and her perspective on doing work that is more dynamic, in nature, that really centers communities from a true equity perspective is, some of the most advanced work that I've seen that could, help us as educational psychologists move forward. For example, I'll give you one small example from one of her papers, her 2016 paper. She mentioned this idea of sustainability for the communities that we partner with. So if you think about it, our grants do what? They run through the university, which means what? The universities take overhead from our grants, or indirect costs from our grants. Why not, if we're really partnering with institutions like community centers, why can't they be trained up to absorb some indirect costs themselves and be their own, entity that can handle at least segments of our grants? And so she's pushed for that, and she's created that within indigenous communities, so that these environments are now, not as dependent on our PWIs, for example, for resources and grants. So they don't have to, be dependent on us. They operate essentially on their own. So that's one example that is well beyond, just doing a single study. It's mission driven, and it's impactful in a big way. Another book that I want to plug is an edited book. It's called White Logic, White Methods. It's pretty thick and dense, and it's an edited book, which means some of the chapters I really gravitate towards a little more than others. But at the end of the day, it's written from more of a sociological perspective, but it forces us to think about, what race actually means in our studies that we do. So those are two resources that I would go to first. And just a third, I might turn to Linda Tillman's article on culturally sensitive approaches to doing research with African Americans. We've dropped that in the group me, but we can drop it in the Zoom chat as well. that article I feel has really, elevated my thinking quite a bit because it provides very concrete strategies. And that one is published in Ed Researcher.
Okay.
Can I also plug in a book? If that's okay. So Savage Inequalities by Jonathan Kozol is really, really a great sort of book to really think about the racialized and gendered historical experiences of students in schools. And so I think that that's a really nice book to really situate yourself and really start learning as like a white scholar, for instance, of the experiences of students of color in the sort of inequitable experiences that they're facing in schools every day. And so I just wanted to plug that book, and I can put it below as well.
Okay. So the next question is a two-part, almost a three-part question, and that's what challenges are unique to conducting community-engaged research, and how's your team address these challenges? Second part of that being, what preventative measures might teams take to reduce potential challenges in this important work?
Okay, let me start with the biggest one that I see, which is that if you're really centering the communities that you're partnering with in your work, the schools, the teachers, they have their own priorities, needs, timelines, strengths, assets, which means that we have to relinquish the control or the perceived control that we have and really just share power. And so that's very, very difficult for us as researchers to do because it forces us to question our time, and the way we spend our time in schools. If we're really sharing power, then part of that means maybe for the first year, we're just observing, learning, helping, supporting, but maybe no data is being collected. So one of the things that we talked about in my class was around risk tolerance and just like how long can you go without data being collected? Like who do you primarily want to serve? Who is your public? Is it the communities? Is it the scholarly community of educational psychology? Like who do you think about first is wanting to provide a contribution to? So, sometimes there's a lot of tension between what matters to which interest group. And so, making those tough decisions is a big challenge in the work. In addition to thinking about the way you can be flexible while still like moving ahead in a way that is meaningful. When you're truly flexible, you can get to more aha moments, deeper conceptual and theoretical insights than you otherwise would. But in the same time, when you're writing grants and designing a research project or even an IRB, you gotta kind of state your plan up front. And so depending on the type of funder or even like the institution that you're at, you might not have the type of flexibility that you need to engage the way you want to. So being intentional about finding ways to be flexible is the biggest challenge. Did anyone else want to chime in on any of that or add an additional challenge that they've thought about? What was the other part of the question? We had challenges, but what was the other part?
Yeah, the other thing was preventative measures that the teams could take to reduce potential challenges.
I got a good one. Okay, I got a good one. At least I think it's good. We have to have other projects going, right? The reason why I say that is because when I present my research, sometimes scholars who are more advanced would say, well, when in your career can you do something like this? Can you really do this as a graduate student? Can you really do this as an early career scholar? Or do you have to have tenure before you start taking these types of risks because this work takes a lot of time? Don't sell dreams and tell people that it's possible to do this work if you know what the standards of promotion and tenure are, and they're not going to be able to get it if they take all these risks in this way. What I would say is if you have data to publish on, then that would allow you to not be as thirsty when it comes to connecting with community partners and needing to like get some type of meaningful data collected ASAP, right? So give yourself some breathing room, by having, we know publications are currency, we know data is currency. So we got to have some of that, stashed away first, almost, or build the partnership up in a way that kind of just chips away at things over time, rather than, some things are front burner, some things are back burner. So know when to bring the community engaged scholarship work to the front. But if it needs to be in the back for a while, that's where it needs to be. And for me, navigating the tenure track, it was on the back burner until it really started to ramp up in terms of getting funding and all that. But before that, I was publishing on data that I had already. So be strategic about it and not lose sight of what the standards really are. Universities should care that we're helping people, but we know what the standards are first in our field. So let's make sure we handle our for sures. And then when it's time for that work to really take off and we're really in a position to do so, that's when we flip the switch.
Excellent. Let's see here. We have 4 minutes left. So I'm gonna bring up one question, and your team can get a quick read on it and see how you might respond to this. This might be the last question we'll be able to take. We'll see, but let's see how this goes. So the last question I was going to ask is, it comes from our community again, from the chat, and it says, how can we shift away from deficit language, which is really common in ed psych research? You see terms such as struggling reader, achievement gap, knowledge gap, and then move toward more of an asset-based description of our participants. This seems particularly tough in ed psych, simply because ed psych is about the mind, and oftentimes we talk about the mind, and that happens to sort of point the finger at the individual, and it's a little bit harder to sort of acknowledge the social, historical, and cultural forces at work that sort of act on the individual. And so we're just kind of wondering, what are your thoughts with that?
Well, two thoughts. One thought, I want to go to some scholarship that has been helpful for me, and that's the work of Tara Yoso. She has this framework called Community Cultural Wealth, and I want to thank my former pre-doctoral fellow for the SMART Collaborative, Moriel Amici, for putting me on to that article. But in that, she breaks down all of the different ways that our community partners have wealth. So thinking about it in terms of wealth kind of shifts the conversation a little bit. In the same way, Jason, your point is well taken around our focus on the mind. I think what we have to do is think about structural, features of our environment as well, and just privilege those in the conversation and just acknowledge, where we are in terms of what our data allows us to look at, but, maybe broadening the discussion to think about what else, makes sense for our frameworks or what our blind spots are. So, just knowing that we focus on the individual a little more than structure, just thinking about zooming out a little bit. Scholars in our field have talked about context, but approaching that from more of a critical perspective to think about what are the pillars, let's say curriculum inside of the school that we don't really touch as much in our work, but how can we shape that foundation to really talk about the white cultural platform that our learning is based off of when we think about the curricular elements that are in place, right? So we have to at least mention that in our work, because I think it's responsible to do that, because we need to provide the right context for even evaluating the merits of our work and be responsible in our reporting. So in discussions is a beautiful place to zoom back out to the broader picture in our work.
Okay, great. It looks like that's all the time we have. As a reminder, if you'd like to keep the conversation going, you can continue interacting with others using the Group Me app. We would like to thank Dr. Gray, his students, and the webinar committee for their work on this. We'd also like to thank our attendees for joining us during this difficult and uncertain time. We wish you and your family well, and we look forward to seeing you in future webinars.